Hi everybody, welcome to our video on Indigenous heritage, American Indians, and Alaska Natives. Today we are going to talk about, first of all, basic demographics, kind of an introduction to Indigenous people. Then we will cover some culture characteristics, strengths, and challenges that people in this group face. And then we will talk a little bit about implications for your own clinical practice. Okay, so first of all, just as an introduction, you may not be very familiar with the term Indigenous. A lot of people are not. We're going to talk a little bit about why that might be a little bit later. But just for right now, what Indigenous means, it has to do with descendants of those who inhabited a country or a geographical region at a time when people of a different culture or ethnic origin arrived. That definition is from the UN. And why this is important is because when the new people from a different culture arrive and they become dominant through conquest or war, settlement, and other means, then that has a cultural implication. It has a lot of implications, but one of them is cultural for the Indigenous people. It can have an effect on the language that is spoken in that area, the kinds of resources that they have available to them, the way that social systems and schools are run. And then the Indigenous people, the people who were originally there, need to negotiate that with the people that arrive later. And the people who arrive later, that is called colonization. So it's the act of possessing or inhabiting a distant land by a group of emigrants or their descendants. And colonization has traumatic effects for the Indigenous people who were originally there. Okay. Indigenous people often have much in common with other neglected or marginalized segments of society. So many of the things we've learned about from the other pieces of the course with regard to race or gender, sexual orientation, even age, what it's like to be a minority and experience sometimes the trauma of being a targeted group, a lot of that will also be at play here. Okay, so the term Indigenous has prevailed as a generic term for many years. It's used also internationally, but there's also national preferences. So within the US, there are a lot of tribes. There's also tribes internationally, but let's see, within Australia, they might use the word Aboriginal. There might be very specific ethnic groups within certain countries that are Indigenous groups. And then I've listed a couple of others there that I don't know how to say actually. But the idea is that within each nation, there might be different terms that are used for the Indigenous people there. There are other terms that might be used that have more to do with occupation or geography. And so, for example, hunter-gatherers or nomads. And I'm highlighting this right now because we're going to talk a lot about Indigenous people within the US, but it's important to recognize that there has been colonization around the world. So this is an international issue. Okay. Let's see, it's estimated that there are more than 370 million Indigenous people spread across 70 different countries. And each one of those groups has traditional practices that are unique. And they have their own social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics. And those are distinct from the colonizers who, or the majority, the dominant culture that comes in. Okay. There are Indigenous groups and people from the Arctic to the South Pacific, and let's see, I think that's all I want to say about that. I think, yes, so I have a map next, just to highlight for you the different areas that have been colonized and then also have Indigenous people there. You'll notice that there's not a lot of that happening in Europe. Mostly that's because that's where the colonizers were coming from. Okay. So I have a couple of quotations here as an introduction. In 1887, the U.S. government determined that Indians were incapable of managing their own land. So they placed the property in a trust, promising the Indians that they would receive income from their land. They never did. In 1999, a federal judge ruled that the government had breached its sacred trust duties. And then a second one. Of the 175 Indian languages once spoken in the United States, only about 20 are still passed on to younger generations. James Jackson Jr. remembers his experience in a boarding school when a teacher grabbed him when he was speaking his native language and threatened to wash his mouth out with soap. That's where we lost our language. So before I go into the demographics, if I say something like forced relocation at gunpoint, genocide, mass graves, death marches, and extermination, I want you to think about what comes to mind. And for a lot of people, what comes to mind is going to be World War II, Hitler, and maybe other international conflicts and genocides that have happened. But there's also a genocide that happened within the US, and it was with Native American people. And what happened with the Native American folks in the Americas predated Hitler. And I can't find out if this is actually true, but there are many people who say that Hitler used the multifaceted system that he saw within the US for genocide, and he modeled his genocide after what we did in the US. Okay, because it was multifaceted. It was not just killing, which it was that, but it was also forced relocation, dealing with culture and social issues, and trying to kill those off and impose something else. So I want to start with that recognition because this is a really weighty topic, and it's not something that we think a lot about in the US, but it's incredibly important, and I don't want to take the issue too lightly. So who are these people? It's when we talk about Indigenous people of the Americas or within the US, it's a highly heterogeneous group. There's 565 distinct tribes in the US. American Indians and Alaska Natives make up about 0.9%, so less than 1% of the total US population. And there's an additional 1.81 million reporting having Indian roots. 34% live on reservations, and 57% reside in cities. And fewer American Indians are high school graduates. Other issues are demographics first. So the poverty rate is about double the US average. Poverty is a big issue. Also because there are few American Indians in the US, they're susceptible to stereotypes. There's less contact and so less understanding. One example of this is Indian-themed mascots, which is a big issue. You may have seen commercials about this. Also, American Indian high school students and college students who view negative media about Indians report higher levels of depression and lower self-esteem. So why is it an issue that there are negative media representations of American Indians? Well, one of the reasons it's an issue is because it affects the psychology of kids and adolescents who are developing in the midst of that negative media. Okay, so I want you to think a little bit about this topic, and does it seem related to you? Does it seem like something that you think about or is important to talk about? And then I would encourage you to just consider why is that? Like whether you think it's really important or not very important. Why do you feel that way, and what do you think has led to those thoughts and feelings for you? I'd like you to consider what your experiences have been with Indigenous peoples. If you've had any, what has that been like? And what is it like to consider the decimation of the Native peoples of America? And then also to consider that we are all part of a system that benefits from their sacrifice. This is similar to the conversations we had around slavery, that one of the reasons that America is an economic and social power within the world is because we have stolen resources from other people, and we have built a nation upon that. So what is it like for you to consider that? All right. Now let's go into a little bit of what constitutes an American Indian or a Native American. Now, this can be confusing because there's no universal rule. One way that we might define this has to do with the U.S. Census, which is just self-report if people would define themselves that way. Congress has also tried to understand or kind of group people, and that is done by blood quantum levels. Individual tribes also make their own criteria about who is in and who is not in, and this could be about enrollment or blood levels, and this matters because it who has rights to children. It's like adoption issues with their populations we've talked about. Also, who gets to benefit from the resources of the tribe. So for example, with casinos, but there's other things too, like resources or rights that American Indians have. And so it's very important for many people. It can be very important who defines who's in and out. And then, there's this fundamental right of a nation to define their own membership. For example, we talked about last week within the U.S. Who has citizenship, and then who gets the rights of the citizens. It's a similar thing with Native American tribes. Okay, so cultural characteristics. First of all, there's a tribal social structure for Native Americans, and this is important because it does provide a structure and it provides social support and strength. There's a value of listening and observing rather than reacting, rather than necessarily talking. You learn by listening. There's spiritual traditions and practices. Those act as protective factors, and there tends to be a focus on the present moment, less planning and worrying about the future and more focus on the present. More cultural values, a value of spirituality generally, that there is mind, there is body, and there is spirit also. A respect for traditional values. A connection to extended family. Allegiance to the family, the community, and the tribe. It's more collectivistic in that way. A respect for elders. And a respect for environment and the land, that we are connected to the environment and connected to the land. And then there's promotion of themes of belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. Now getting a little bit into the health statistics. So thinking about the experience of Native Americans, alcoholism and the mortality rate is twice the U.S. population rate as a whole. Obesity and diabetes are also much higher. I think those are reported to the CDC or by the CDC. Injury-related deaths, like those that are listed there, occur more frequently. And 75% of all deaths of American Indians and Alaska Native Americans between ages 1 and 19, 75% of those deaths are due to injury. High infant mortality rates within this population compared to the overall U.S. population, and then psychological experiences, mental illness is also much higher, and alcoholism. Okay. So I went over some characteristics, including some values, and I want to talk now about how those link with clinical implications. So if you are working with someone who identifies as Native American, they may be experiencing some of the things that we saw in the former slide, and then when you work with them, you want to consider the characteristics and values of Native American culture when you're working with them, of course. So, so thinking about how the characteristic of a tribal social structure impacts psychotherapy. So first of all, there are those that live on reservations, and then there are those that do not live on reservations. And regardless of that, tribe is often a fundamental aspect of life. So this gives a sense of belonging and of security. And individuals, even when they're not with the tribe, are seen as an extension of the tribe. And so this could impact a person because they might send resources back, or they might visit, even if they're not living on the tribe or living on the reservation with the tribe. So implications here would be to assess the importance of the tribal relationship. It's going to be more important for some than for others, but it's something important to think about. And sometimes leaving the reservation or leaving the proximity of a tribe can have psychological ramifications, such as losing a sense of your own kind of personal identity and belonging there. Okay, the characteristic of family structure. So this is an important thing to think about also because some Native families are matriarchal, some are more patriarchal. There are often strong roles for women within tribal culture. So you can think about who the children are raised by. If it's a more collectivist culture, there might be extended family that are involved. And so implications here are to include those folks within the therapy, right? And determine the roles of different family members and how they can be part of the treatment. And if your goals in psychotherapy kind of go against extended family members or value independence and maybe separation from the family, that there's the potential that's going to cause other problems for the individual that you're working with, or might lead to discord. So it's a good idea to be collaborative with the folks who are involved. Sharing is another value, and there's honor and respect gained by sharing and by giving. And this is really in contrast to a dominant Western culture, which is more about accumulation and consumerism, right? And so sharing and giving is a different way of earning honor and respect. So Native American folks might stop working when enough money is earned. They might not work as much so that energy can be spent on sharing or on ceremonies or on giving back. And so take this into consideration when you're working with someone, whatever interventions you're doing. Another value is cooperation. Folks who highly identify with a Native American culture often work hard to prevent discord and prevent disharmony. And the whole, which might be the tribe or the family, takes precedence over the individual. So the implication here is that instead of going to work or going to school, some people might actually prioritize assisting the family or staying with the family. There might be a reluctance to compete, right? Because they might not want to compete. They might want to work with as opposed to being in competition. And that might look like someone's not motivated, but it's actually a different value, right? Let's see. Another value is around spirituality. So the mind, body, and the spirit are all interconnected, and sometimes illness is actually seen as discord between the mind, body, and the spirit. And positive emotions can be curative. And so being with family, being with the environment, experiencing the energy and the positivity of your community can be seen as very, very healing. And so traditional curative approaches might try and utilize those things in order to help a person feel better. And so consider that and maybe assess that if you're working with someone who is Native American. And you can use the client-centered approach and a more collaborative, generative solution in order to achieve balance. The last value that I have on here is the nonverbal communication. So because there's a value around listening, there might be a tendency to listen before speaking, and which might translate into not asking a lot of questions, or somebody might not seem as engaged, but it might be because somebody is listening. So there could be misunderstandings that take place because of differences in nonverbal communication and differences in how one expresses motivation. So it might be a good idea to determine whether specific behaviors are cultural values or actual problems or something that is not working for the person that you're working with. Okay. So some specific challenges of folks that are Native American. Let's see. So there's all of this historical and socio-political background with regard to government extermination efforts, wars, diseases. Those decimated the population. So by the 18th century, about only 10% of the original population remained. That's 90% of folks were killed by extermination efforts, wars, and diseases. So there's this massive loss of people and a massive loss of land, which means a loss of status. All right. By the 1830s, there was forced relocation to reservations in Oklahoma. Indian children were removed from homes and placed in English-speaking boarding schools. And removing children from the cultural home, taking them somewhere else and educating them to a different cultural way of being, they lose their language, and they lose that cultural tie, which then means a whole new generation coming up is not going to be able to pass on the former culture to their children, right? So 8 years away from their families where they were taught the culture of the dominant culture. Children were also placed with non-Indian families until the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. So this means that if a child was pulled from an Indian home by Child Protective Services, it might be placed with a non-Indian family, and there again, there's a severing of the family and a severing of the culture, and which means that just in one generation, you're going to lose more of the Indian population and the Indian culture. So this prevents, obviously, the transmission of cultural values from parents to children. Rituals, traditions, practices, language, all of that is prevented. And this results in unresolved grief. Some writers write about this as soul wounds. It leads to emotional, behavioral dysfunction, substance abuse, and this is cultural oppression and social injustice. Okay. So if you're working with someone who's Native American, it's important to keep this in mind as a big picture, right? And if we think about intergenerational trauma, this is something to consider, how it's affected the person that you're sitting with. And also it's important to think about local issues. So each tribe has their own history, right? Their own cultural oppression, social injustices that have taken place that are different depending on the tribe and the location, the reservation, historically what that looked like, but also current issues around like casinos are a big deal right now. So consider those things when you're working with someone, both the larger issues and also the local issues. Today there are fights over land, there are broken treaties, there are battles led by officials to remove or limit fishing and hunting rights. Also within the Midwest right now, as they're doing more oil and gas drilling, there are issues around the land and who has the ability to do that to the land. And they're just different cultural values, right? Where the Western values are for accumulation and resources and utilizing those resources, whereas with the native populations, it's more about protecting the environment and protecting the land. So much of the land has been stripped from them. It's understandable why they might want to protect and not let the land the very little bit of land that they still have left be used for the Western purposes. But if you're poor and you really need money, and your family is having a hard time, there's some clash within the native populations. Okay, so some more specific challenges. There are educational concerns with regard to school failure, dropout, and of course, if there's not education happening, this perpetuates the cycle of poverty, reduced opportunities, and then also stereotypes. Acculturation conflict, so the degree to which someone identifies with native culture is, the assimilation or acculturation, and then children and adolescents being citing Indianness as being a problem, right? So there's the identity threat or the stereotype threat that affects, of course, a child or adolescent psychology. A few more specific challenges. Alcoholism, substance abuse, those things, of course, are related to all kinds of psychological issues, and community-oriented programs tend to be most beneficial for that because they take into account the value of collectivism. Domestic violence can be very difficult to assess, but is definitely an issue for Native American folks. And then suicide is a huge one. So Native American and Alaska Native youth have twice the rate of attempted and completed suicide as other youth. So again, effective programs are culturally consistent and multifaceted. Okay, so a real quick summary of implications for clinical practice. Let's see, too often Native people have suffered oppression in the name of traditional Western psychotherapy. So this means like not even considering the socio-historical context, focusing on the current psychological experience, maybe intrapsychic issues, and that is going to be problematic and not culturally sensitive at all. So it's important to use background information to inform assessment, goal setting, and intervention strategies. And here are some issues that you might want to consider exploring. So first of all, the ethnic identity, tribal affiliation, and adherence to cultural values. So how closely does this person relate to and feel tied to the native culture? Also, family members and association to tribe or reservation. Determining the appropriateness of a mind, body, spirit emphasis, which means getting a little bit more comfortable maybe with working around spiritual issues. Exploring acculturation and adherence to traditional and or mainstream values. And so those are some issues to explore. And the idea here is that you can generate concrete goals and solutions with the client that incorporate many community perspectives and holistic factors. All right. Things you might want to do on your own have to do with learning about local issues associated with the client's tribe or reservation. So wherever you end up practicing, it's a good idea to think about what has happened to the indigenous people of that place, right? Were they forced to relocate, or are you living in a place close to a reservation? And evaluate using a client-centered listening style initially, and allow sufficient time, not hurrying the client, because again, there's a value of taking time and not rushing. If necessary, you might need to address basic needs first, such as problems with food, shelter, childcare, employment, other resources. So there is the Indian Health Services program and tribal programs. Those might be things that you need to think about. We think about social workers as doing those things, but if you're using a holistic approach, you might want to be in partnership with other local agencies or help your client get connected to resources. And be alert for some of the problems that we know are higher within Native American populations. So those include domestic violence, substance abuse, depression, and suicidal ideation. Now, as we've discussed with other topics, it's important not to blame the victim here. There are social, cultural, historical reasons for basically surviving a trauma, and the intergenerational trauma has produced these kinds of problems within this population. Okay, assessment and intervention. As you're doing an assessment, allow time for a historical understanding, thinking about the intergenerational trauma. You might want to consider using tribal genograms. So this helps you consider the collectivistic perspective and finding the historical place of the trauma, because you can do multiple generations, and maybe there are whole groups of people that experience trauma. It might help you understand some of that. Spirit and soul language, again, depending on the tribe and the person's attachment to the tribe and spirituality. You might focus on healing and liberation rather than symptoms and disorders, just because it's a different worldview, right? The Western psychology often has a worldview around symptoms, disorders, diagnosis, and treatment, whereas a more holistic approach might not be as much about symptoms and might more be about healing and bringing balance and clarity, finding liberation, okay? And if you feel a reluctance from the person that you're sitting with, if you feel like there's something happening and you're not quite sure what's not working, consider your cultural framework. Consider how you are flexing, and consider what might not be fitting. And I think this is my last slide today with content, but in conclusion, I guess what I would encourage you to do is stop, reinvent, and modify what you've been trained to do, and develop new healing strategies if you're working with someone who is Native American. This will include building an awareness of your client's worldview, expectations, values, and needs, and then modifying yourself, right, to fit those things. Have courage to lean into this, and there's a real value of human dignity and cultural diversity. And so if you can lean into those things and see the beauty in the culture that your client is bringing to you, it's going to be a better fit, and it's more likely to work out well for both of you. So for further information, here's a couple of books that I have been reading and I think are really fantastic. You can find them on Amazon, as you can find most everything. And yeah, if you have any other interest in this, please come talk to me. I think it would be really cool to talk about this because we don't talk about it very much at Widener. And I will also add readings to your shared files list so that you can, yeah, get a little bit more information. Okay, thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and we'll talk about it more in class on Thursday. Bye!